Have you ever wondered how close you've come to danger without even realizing it? At Shivering Vault, we take you there, one story at a time. But before you drift off, consider liking this video and commenting where you're watching from. Now, let's dive into these chilling stories. It's not like I've never been scared on the job before. I've worked as a night security guard at this industrial site in California for almost a year now. The place is empty for the most part, just a handful of workers during the day, and then me alone at night. But this night, something happened that made me question everything about this job. I remember the first time I noticed something strange. It was during the middle of my shift, around 2 a.m. I was doing my usual rounds, walking the perimeter, checking the gates, and making sure nothing was out of place. The site is pretty large, so it usually takes me a good hour or so to get everything done. I've got a set routine. Check the main gate, check the secondary one, the little maintenance sheds, and the back lot where they store all the old machinery. Nothing ever really happens. It's just boring. But that night, when I got to the front gate, I noticed it was unlocked. I'm not talking about just a little ajar. I'm talking about wide open, the heavy steel gate swinging on its hinges like someone had just come through. Now, I know I locked that gate earlier in my rounds, right after I checked the perimeter for the first time. I remember it clearly because I always double check everything before I walk away. So I stood there for a second, staring at it. My flashlight beam bounced off the lock. It wasn't even latched. It wasn't just unlocked. It was left that way on purpose. For a moment, I thought maybe I was just tired. Maybe I'd missed it the first time. Maybe the wind. But as I walked closer, my gut twisted. There was no way I could have missed this. I always lock that gate. There's no reason for it to be open now. I pulled out my radio and tried to reach dispatch. No answer. That's the thing about working at a site this remote. There's barely any signal out here, especially in the dead of night. The only way I could reach anyone was by using the company radio, and that was hit or miss on a good day. I stood there for a few minutes, just listening. Everything was silent. Too silent. After a while, I decided to check the area around the gate. I walked around the perimeter of the site, shining my flashlight across the dark fields, the storage containers, and the broken down trailers. There was no sign of anything unusual, no cars, no footprints, nothing. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I had this nagging sensation crawling at the back of my neck. Someone had been here and they knew what they were doing. It didn't make sense, but it felt deliberate. I locked the gate again, double-checked it, then I moved on with my rounds, trying to push the unease down. But it stuck with me, like a shadow I couldn't shake off. The rest of the night passed without incident. That was the worst part. I kept thinking about it, but nothing else seemed out of place. Just the usual quiet hum of the site. But that gate being open was always there in the back of my mind, hanging over me like a bad omen. The next night, it happened again. I'd been checking the secondary gates around the back of the property, just like I always did. Nothing unusual. No strange cars parked along the access roads. No signs of forced entry. I felt better, more confident that maybe it was a fluke, that maybe I was just paranoid. Then I came around to the front gate. It was unlocked again, and this time it wasn't just unlocked. It was wide open. I could hear the metal creak in the wind as I stood there, staring at it in disbelief. I pulled out my radio again. Same result. No answer. By now, I had a sinking feeling that I was being watched. That this wasn't some random mistake, but something much worse. I was on edge, but I tried to stay calm. I locked the gate again, but this time I wasn't as careful as I should have been. I felt like someone was right behind me, waiting to make a move. I spent the next hour circling the perimeter again. My flashlight flickered as I checked every corner, the back lot and the maintenance sheds. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, but I never saw anyone. Just shadows stretching long under the dim light of my flashlight. I had no idea how someone could get in without me noticing. The whole perimeter is fenced in, and there are cameras everywhere. I'd seen the footage before, and there was never anything out of the ordinary. But that night, it felt like someone had figured out a way around all of it. And then I heard it, a noise. It wasn't anything dramatic at first, just a slight shuffle, like someone moving carefully trying to stay quiet. It came from the far end of the site, near one of the old storage sheds. I froze, listening, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. My heart started pounding in my chest. I called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" No response, just the sound of the wind rustling through the old machinery. I thought about walking towards it. I was trained for situations like this. I had a baton, a radio, and a flashlight. I should have called for backup. The place was so isolated, and I couldn't get anyone on the radio anyway. It was my responsibility to check things out. So I walked toward the sound, my shoes crunching on the gravel. The noise stopped, but my sense of dread grew with every step I took. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing up, and I felt that familiar sinking feeling in my stomach again, like something terrible was about to happen. I rounded the corner of one of the trailers, and there he was. A man. He was standing there in the shadows, just out of the light, and for a moment, I didn't know what to do. I couldn't see his face, just a dark figure, but I could feel his eyes on me, like he was waiting for something. He wasn't holding anything in his hands, but I could tell he wasn't supposed to be there. I called out again, "Hey, what the hell are you doing here?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he stepped forward, and that's when I saw the glint of something metallic in his hand. A crowbar. My heart dropped. I instinctively took a step back, but before I could react, he lunged at me, swinging the crowbar in a wide arc. I barely managed to dodge it, the metal whooshing past my face. In that moment, everything slowed down. I could hear my breath coming in ragged gasps, feel the adrenaline pumping through my veins. I swung at him with my baton, trying to knock the crowbar out of his hands, but he was fast. Too fast. He moved like he knew exactly where I was going to be. He managed to land a hit to my side, knocking the wind out of me. I staggered back, fighting to keep my balance, but I knew I couldn't take another hit like that. I had to get away. I threw myself forward, pushing him into one of the storage containers. He stumbled back, and that's when I made my move. I swung the baton as hard as I could, hitting him in the shoulder. He yelped in pain, dropping the crowbar, and I immediately grabbed it, ready to defend myself if he came at me again. I don't know how long we stood there, but it felt like an eternity. He was breathing hard, trying to catch his breath, but I didn't give him a chance. I backed away, radio in hand, and finally got a call through. Back up. Now. Within minutes, another security team arrived, and the man was arrested. He didn't put up a fight. He just slumped over, defeated. Turns out he had been watching my routine for weeks. He knew exactly when I'd be at the front gate, when I'd be making my rounds, and he was waiting for the right moment to slip in. He was a thief. He'd been trying to steal copper wiring from the site. The worst part, he had access to the security footage. He'd been studying me for days. The police said he wasn't working alone, but I never found out who the others were. All I know is that I almost didn't make it out of that night. I've been more careful since. I lock everything twice, check every gate, and I don't go anywhere without my radio. This happened when I was working the night shift at a small remote gas station on the outskirts of a town in California. It wasn't a busy place. Most of the traffic was just trucks passing through, maybe the occasional person stopping for a quick snack or fuel. It was a quiet job, one that let me zone out to music or podcasts to pass the time, only breaking the silence when a customer came in. That night, it was like any other. The clock had just hit 11 p.m. when I saw the headlights of a car approaching. The station wasn't right off the highway, so if someone came in at this hour, they were usually just stopping to fill up or grab something from the small convenience store. I wasn't expecting anything strange, just another uneventful shift. The car pulled up to the pump. It was an old sedan, dusty with a faded paint job. I didn't think much of it. People with cars like that usually just needed gas and a bathroom break. I watched the man inside the car for a second. He looked off, but I couldn't really explain why. He had a hood pulled low over his head, and I couldn't see his face. He sat in the car for a little longer than usual, staring straight ahead. Then, after what felt like a long time, he stepped out and started walking towards the door. I barely even looked up when he came in, thinking it was just some guy coming in to buy a pack of smokes or something. But as soon as the door opened, I felt a strange tension in the air. I looked up, and that's when I saw him. His face was barely visible beneath the hoodie, but his eyes, they were intense, locked on me, not blinking. I can't describe it, but there was something about his stare that felt wrong, like I wasn't just a cashier to him. He was studying me, sizing me up. He stepped up to the counter, but he didn't immediately ask for anything. He just stood there for a moment, as if deciding how to speak to me. I smiled awkwardly, trying to stay friendly, but my gut was starting to twist. Can I help you with something?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation normal. He took a deep breath and then asked, "What time do you close?" His voice was a bit raspy, almost like he hadn't spoken in a while. We're open 24/7, I replied, glancing over at the clock on the wall. "The station never closes." He nodded, his hoodie barely shifting. Then he asked, "How long have you been working here?" Something about that question threw me off. I mean, why would someone care how long I've been working at a gas station, right? But I just shrugged it off and answered, "A few months," I said, feeling that nervous tension grow. "It's not a bad job, but it can get pretty slow." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked around the store, scanning the shelves like he was waiting for something to catch his eye. I felt like I was being watched the entire time, his gaze always on me, even when his eyes were pointed at the racks of chips or the drink cooler. I tried to shake it off. It was just a guy making small talk, I told myself. But then he asked another question that really didn't sit right with me. "You ever get lonely working out here all by yourself?" he asked, his voice a little softer now, like it was a personal question. I smiled uneasily, trying to keep the situation light. "Nah, not really. People come through now and then, so it's not so bad." He seemed to think about that for a second, his eyes narrowing just slightly. It was weird, but the more I looked at him, the more I felt like something wasn't right. Like he wasn't just some random guy passing through. He wasn't here for gas or snacks. He was here for something else. "I bet it gets really quiet, huh?" he continued, his voice lowering. "In the middle of the night when everyone's gone." I nodded, my heart starting to race a little. "Yeah, it's pretty quiet." Then, without warning, he asked, "What do you do when no one's around? What do you do when it's just you?" I froze. His question felt too pointed, too personal, like he was trying to figure out something about me that I wasn't ready to give him. I wasn't sure if I should answer or just ignore him. But before I could respond, he reached into his hoodie pocket and pulled out a small, nondescript black object. I didn't know what it was at first, but the shape of it, the way his fingers curled around it, made my heart skip a beat. My mind raced. Was it a weapon? A knife? A gun? I couldn't tell, and that's when I started to panic. What's that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he just looked at me, his eyes still too intense. Then, finally, he put the object down on the counter in front of me. It was a pack of cigarettes. No big deal, but the whole situation felt so wrong. Like he'd just been playing some weird game with me, trying to make me uncomfortable. I breathed a little easier, but still, something wasn't right. My instincts were screaming at me. Get out. Get away. I should have just called the cops right then and there, but I didn't. I was frozen, too scared to make a move, like I was stuck in a trance. He paid for the cigarettes, his fingers brushing against the counter, and then he turned to leave. As he walked toward the door, I felt a brief flash of relief. He was leaving. But before he stepped outside, he turned back to me and asked one last question, one that made my blood run cold. "You know, it's a little weird," he said, his voice low, "being out here, all alone at night. Anything could happen, and there's no one to help you." I didn't know how to respond. The words stuck in my throat. He gave me one last look, almost like he was sizing me up one final time, before walking out the door. I don't know why, but I watched him through the window as he got into his car and drove off. The headlights cutting through the dark, his taillights disappearing down the empty road. I stood there for a few seconds, just staring at the empty parking lot, feeling like something was about to happen. It was the weirdest feeling, like I'd just narrowly avoided something terrible. But then the thought hit me. What if he wasn't leaving? I quickly checked the security cameras in the back office, but I didn't see his car anymore. It had disappeared down the road, so I tried to calm myself down. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Then about 10 minutes later, the door chime rang again. My heart skipped. I looked up and saw the man standing at the door. He was back, but this time, something was different. He wasn't just standing there, he was staring straight at me. His eyes filled with something cold, something violent. And that's when I realized I was in danger. I barely had time to react. He pushed the door open forcefully, and before I could even register what was happening, he was on me, jumping over the counter in a blur of movement. He grabbed for me, his hands reaching for my neck, his breath hot and erratic. I screamed, panic surging through me. I fought back, trying to push him off, but his grip was too strong. I struggled, but I couldn't break free. I don't know how I managed it, but I broke away for just a second. I bolted toward the back room, my heart pounding in my chest. I slammed the door behind me, locking it just as I heard him slam into it from the other side. I grabbed my phone, dialing 911 as fast as I could, trying not to cry. The operator answered, and I whispered, "Please help. There's someone here," trying to hurt me. I could hear him pounding on the door, his voice muffled but still there, shouting at me to open up. "Stay calm," the operator said. "Help is on the way." Minutes felt like hours. I didn't know if I was going to make it. But then, finally, I heard sirens in the distance, the sound of police cars approaching. The man outside started to panic, shouting at me to let him in, but I didn't move. When the police arrived, they surrounded the building. They found him still there, trying to break through the back door. He didn't even try to run. He was arrested on the spot. Turns out he wasn't just some random guy. He was a wanted criminal, responsible for a string of similar assaults and robberies across the state. He'd been targeting gas stations like mine for months, waiting for the right moment to make his move. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't locked myself in that back room. Maybe I would have been hurt. Maybe worse. But I'm just glad the cops showed up when they did. So, yeah, if you're ever working the night shift at a gas station and some guy starts asking weird questions, don't ignore your gut, because sometimes the person you think is harmless is the one who's waiting to hurt you. I've worked the night shift at this 24/7 convenience store for about 6 months now, and most of the time, it's pretty uneventful. The store's small, located on the edge of a quiet neighborhood in California, and not a lot of people come by after midnight. It's just the way I like it, really. The shift gives me time to think, listen to music, and maybe clean up the aisles or stock the shelves. It's a routine that I've gotten used to. That night, though, it was different. I was sweeping the aisles when I noticed him. A man. He was standing outside, just staring at the door. I didn't think much of it at first. People sometimes pause outside, maybe deciding if they want to come in or not. But this guy was different. It was close to 2 a.m. and there weren't any other cars in the parking lot. The streetlights outside made everything look washed out and empty. This guy, though, he wasn't moving. He was just standing there, still as a statue, staring at the door. I tried not to look at him too much. Just one of those weird things that people do when they're out in the night, right? I wasn't really concerned yet, but then something felt off. I don't know what it was. Maybe the way he was standing, like he was waiting for something, or maybe it was the way his eyes didn't seem to blink, just wide open, fixed on the door, like he was watching me without any intention of coming inside. I shrugged it off at first. Maybe he's just waiting for someone, I told myself. Still, I couldn't stop glancing up, watching him through the glass. There was something about him that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. He was tall, wearing a hoodie with the hood pulled over his head, but I could make out his face. Pale skin, a little scruffy, like he hadn't shaved in days. I didn't want to admit it, but it felt like he was waiting for me. So I tried to ignore it. I didn't want to make a big deal out of something that could have just been my imagination. But every time I looked up, he was still there. Standing, watching, not moving. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to go check the parking lot just to make sure there was nothing wrong. Maybe he was just a guy hanging out or waiting for someone. As I walked toward the door, I glanced up one last time. That's when I saw it. His face, his eyes, were fixed on me, like he had been waiting for me to come closer. He didn't flinch, didn't move a muscle. It felt like the air had thickened and I was suffocating under his gaze. Something in me screamed to lock the door, but I didn't. I opened it just a crack, stepping outside into the cool air. I tried to make eye contact, but he just kept staring at me, his eyes cold and unblinking. I asked, "Can I help you with something?" He didn't answer, just kept staring at me, his eyes fixed, like he wasn't even hearing me. I started to back away, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. I wasn't scared yet, but I felt unsettled. Something wasn't right. I stepped back inside, quickly pulling the door shut and locking it. My hands were shaking, and I tried to act normal. It's nothing, I told myself. People are weird. But it wasn't nothing. The whole vibe had shifted. I felt like I couldn't breathe. I decided to call my friend just to have someone to talk to. It wasn't like I thought I was in immediate danger, but I didn't want to feel alone with this guy outside. I didn't want to look up again, but I couldn't help it. Every few seconds, I had to glance at the door to make sure he wasn't coming in. Then, after what felt like a long minute, I looked up, and he was gone. Just like that, as though he had never been there. My heart skipped a beat, and I exhaled in relief. That relief didn't last long. About 20 minutes later, I decided to head outside and take out the trash, hoping that whatever had been off about the guy would be over. Maybe he was just some random person who lost interest. I stepped out the back door, pushing the trash can toward the dumpster. As I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I looked over my shoulder. There, at the far end of the parking lot, standing behind a row of bushes, was the same man. He wasn't looking at the store anymore. His eyes were trained on me. My breath caught in my throat. I froze. I ran, straight to the back door, slamming it shut behind me and locking it as fast as I could. My hands were shaking so much that I could barely get the key in the lock. I called my friend again, this time panicked, telling them to stay on the phone with me. My heart was racing. A couple of minutes later, I glanced through the front window, and there he was again, standing just outside staring at me, not moving, not blinking. I had to do something. I grabbed my phone and called the police. I was shaking as I explained everything, telling them about the man who had been staring at me for hours, never once coming inside, and how he'd followed me outside. By the time the police arrived, the man was gone. They checked the area, but he didn't seem to have left anything behind. They couldn't find him. But about an hour later, I got a call from the police. They had found him. He was walking down the street a few blocks away, acting suspicious. When they approached him, he had a bag with him. The cops searched it, and inside they found knives, rope, and a bunch of other stuff. They found out he'd been stalking me for days. He'd been watching the store from across the street for hours, waiting for the right time to make a move. They told me that he had a history of stalking people, and his behavior wasn't random. He'd been planning something. They arrested him on the spot, and when they searched his car, they found more weapons and a list with my name on it. He had been waiting for me to leave my shift so he could follow me home. The cops said it was a good thing I had called them when I did, because he had every intention of attacking me. He'd been getting closer, learning my routine. They later confirmed that he had been watching me for at least a week before that night. I've never felt that kind of fear again. I don't even know what would have happened if I hadn't locked myself inside when I did. But I'm so glad I didn't ignore my instincts. It could have been so much worse. After that night, I transferred to another store, but I still think about it every time I walk past a store window or when someone stares at me for too long. I'll never forget the way he looked at me. Like he wasn't just watching, but waiting. So if you're ever working late at night and you see someone staring at you from outside, don't just brush it off. Trust your gut, because people like him, they don't just stare, they wait. That's it for today's tale from Shivering Vault. If you have a story worth sharing, drop it in the comments or send it our way. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your fellow thrill seekers. As always, the Shivering Vault thanks you for unlocking today's tale. Until next time, the vault awaits your return.